Welcome to the FESPA Sustainability Spotlight video series. We all understand that addressing sustainability is key to future business success and will allow us to reduce our negative social and environmental impacts that are essential to our communities. We're providing information with the help of our guest speakers, thank you, Sam, that will support environmental best practice to enable you to make more progress on your journey. In today's video, I'll be talking with Sam Taylor from The Good Factory, who offer specialist advice on sourcing apparel sustainably. I'm going to let Sam introduce herself and tell us a bit more about her background because she can do it much better than I can. So, Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Graham. So I am a third generation garment producer. My entire family has been in clothing for a very long time, predominantly covering sportswear. But my background is a lot in the sustainable space, particularly around sustainable synthetics. I launched The Good Factory just before our first lockdown in the UK, which was phenomenal timing, where we produce sportswear using preferred materials, using the latest technology, living wages, and full traceability. So we also take on the responsibility for the end of life of the product as well, with multiple manufacturing routes. And really, we just want to make it easier for people to switch out their fabrics and their processes so that it is better for the environment.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's a great introduction. So the focus of our discussion today are to address what are the key considerations when choosing more sustainable fabrics. And I think really let's just kick off with looking at, how do we get started? And are there any shortcuts such as replacing virgin with recycled? Perhaps you can lead in with that one.
I mean, yes, switching out virgin for recycled is I say a really easy switch. In theory, yes, it is a much easier switch. It can be really difficult finding the right qualities of yarn. And this is where, if you're confused between perhaps what is pre-consumer and post-consumer, this is kind of where you get into the nitty-gritty of it, because pre-consumer means generally it's just been in a manufacturing environment. That environment is managed in a way to keep contamination at a minimum, whereas post-consumer waste has a tendency to be contaminated at times. And this is where we kind of really need to understand what that history and that process is. But definitely, if you're looking at reducing your carbon footprint, reducing your water usage, switching out recycled to a recycled fabric is definitely the easiest and most available switch.
Can I ask a quick question about suppliers and the term recycled? In my experience, I seek further information on how much of it is recycled, what if it's got 7% recycled factory trimmings from the production line, that's a kind of a very low order of recycled contribution. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's just a low order. I think, as you say, post-consumer waste is frequently at this stage mechanically recovered, therefore rarely white or clear, and has sort of limited use. But when you're working with mills and suppliers, what's the best way to ascertain from them what quality and percentage of recycling has taken place?
It's asking for the full traceability. branded yarns, so when it comes to recycled branded yarns, that's probably the easiest route to take because you're already paying a premium for having that level of traceability. You do need to get concerned, I think, when if you go to a mill and say, well, where are your yarns from? And they don't tell you, it's quite possible that they don't know. And in which case, then you don't know what percentage that is. I think it's becoming a lot easier now. People are aware, are a lot more aware than they were a year ago, that a recycled fabric is not 100% recycled. In most cases, it can't be, particularly if it is post-consumer waste.
Yeah, because the performance degrades with reprocessing, right? That's the kind of the issue.
Yes, but it's also, there's been contaminants already on, particularly when it comes to things like plastic. If you look, at ocean-based plastic, that has been contaminated with other things, probably oil. If it's, heaven forbid, if it's from around the UK, it's definitely sewage.
Yeah. So just as a matter of interest around the area of mechanical recycling versus chemical recycling, in your experience, are you starting to see, because I'm hearing some conversations about returning using chemical recycling to get back to polymer, monomers and the kind of the fundamental building blocks of the yarns and the fiber itself.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any trends in terms of mechanical versus chemical, and do you think chemical will become more capable as more effort and investments made in that direction?
Absolutely. We're already seeing a massive push for chemical recycling, particularly around polyesters, because it makes up more than 60% of all the textiles that we produce. There is actually a scale up happening in France for, hundreds of thousands of tons of polyester blends that can be recycled. Although the one thing to note with chemical recycling is that, much in the same way as mechanical recycling, in order for it to be financially viable, it does need to be a mono-component garment. So Carabosse, who are the chemical recycler in France, they have said that basically at the point you've got 15% extra stuff in that, and that covers dyes, finishes, other types of fiber types, it doesn't make it financially viable to recycle it. So I think that's going to continue. That mono-component item is still going to be the trend going forward.
Okay, so that mirrors in the graphic digital printing space, the de-inking issue. Things end up becoming, in that space, things end up becoming core materials, like the bulking part of the material, and that then might have a virgin material face attached to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, none of it's easy, that's for sure. So when we're looking at the availability of tools for making sustainable sourcing easier as far as fabric's concerned, what's your inside track on that?
It's, at the moment, in this current space and time, there isn't a lot. I don't know if you know, but the Higg Index was released last year that was supposed to, be an all-encompassing tool to help us do that, but it didn't do a very good job. It missed. It didn't really understand, I think, what it was being asked of it. So they have listened to feedback, and they have now gone back to the drawing board with multiple experts, including the Textile Exchange, who have a wonderful list of preferred fabrics, which is really helpful. And I think certainly today there's not an awful lot, but it will be really interesting to see what Hig come back with when they've reviewed what they've got, because I do think while they were a bit defensive initially, they have understood the market frustration, and will bring something really great to market.
So were there issues around consistency of calculation, or what kind of things, what kind of challenges do they face in providing an index? Because I appreciate, across, when you've got fabrics being used across so many use cases from so many locations, this is an extraordinarily complicated manufacturing world, isn't it?
Yeah. And that was it effectively. They were basing their ratings on LCAs, which are not transparent. Whichever way you want to look at it, they're just not in the way that we need them to be able to give us that good advice. And I think it was really interesting because Walmart really pushed back, because it gave synthetics, virgin synthetics, a much better rating than wool. But as you said, we weren't seeing where that crude oil was initially coming from. And there are studies that have been done that show that, the newer plants or the newer extraction facilities based in the Mexico basin are producing or more methane gas than any of the older facilities. And so already it's worse if it's coming from that plant. Whereas they were looking at an entire life cycle of a sheep. And you can't really compare the two and then say that synthetics are better, because it's not looking at the bigger picture enough.
And I suppose that's a real challenge with, naturally derived, material, like sheep are sympathetic with earth systems in a sense that synthetic oil, petrochemical derived materials are not, because they're persistent in the environment in a very different way. But it does point to the fact that the complexity is, there's a degree of challenge that will be with us for decades to come, isn't there, within these things. And I know that for myself as a consumer, I do try and focus on naturally derived fabrics, but I am aware that actually, like, the shirt I'm wearing today is wool and has great insulating properties, and is lovely, but it might actually have higher emissions than its synthetic counterpart, and that's kind of an issue with. So we've sort of talked about recycling, and that's fundamentally important to reprocess, bring fiber back into play again and again to prevent the introduction of too much virgin material, and that kind of constant extraction approach. Recycling I see is fundamental, and the cyclical. I tend to think of cyclical economy rather than circular, because I think it's very rare that a material made from a product, once recycled, goes back into the same product, that it's more likely to have reuse in another area. But our key goal is for waste to become resource rather than something with zero value, isn't it? That's a cycle that we need to try and break. So, which kind of neatly brings me on to LCAs, and I think you're right. Start and end points. What are you? Where do you determine? How do you determine life cycle analysis, and how do you compare it from one product to another? And I'm not saying that we've got the answers to this, but what would be your guidance on how LCAs can contribute towards better fabric selection?
I think they are a great tool in understanding what is better and why. I think it gives us a really nice starting point to talk about particular fabrics, particularly if you look at the life cycle of, so for example, we use a PA1010, which is a nylon or polyamide created from castor bean oil. And when you look at the LCAs from the resin supplier, the yarn supplier, and the mill, none of them quite match up. And they won't, because of the different processes that they go through, where they get their energy from, you know, the carbon footprint of a resin that is finished in a factory that's coal powered versus renewable, you know, that all has an impact. But it's also understanding why is that rating what it is, and how does that impact you? So what we really like about the PA1010 is the fact that it can be printed on at lower temperatures. So it's further reducing
energy.
Further reducing energy needs, further reducing that your carbon footprint, and that's what I think brings the story in. It gets very complicated when you add in multiple different sector or stages of the process, which is effectively what we do in textiles. But what LCAs do is they give us a transparency throughout the chain, and that's what we're looking for. The Better Cotton Initiative are trialing a product passport now for their cotton that's coming out of India, which, after the whole drama with Xinjiang, is really exciting, because it means that we get traceability. You know, we're understanding where water sources are stressed. Are we contributing to that? So there's a lot of improvement that needs to happen with LCAs, but they're a really good start.
Yeah, I'm not sure if my geography is correct, whether it was Kazakhstan, where there was a huge lake they increased their cotton production, and the unintended consequence was that a massive lake has all but disappeared and has completely ruined local community. And I suppose, you know, we have to be careful, don't we, that we might of the unintended consequences. We might start on a venture with a very solid and kind of admirable approach, but things are rarely quite as simple as they seem. I can see that the value of LCAs is it gives you the chance to make some benchmarking, some comparators, some just to understand more when making a decision. So even if your decision is unlikely to be perfect, it can always be better.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe that's kind of what, at this stage in you know, sustainability 2.0, you know, we that's kind of where we are, isn't it? And I think
yes, as individual businesses, that's the best that is able to be done, because we need so much more government intervention than I think we realize, in order to get these initiatives off the ground, and what have you. So yes, just trying for better. It's great to have a roadmap. I think, you know, going back to, you know, your first question about how do we make it easy? If you have a roadmap, to, you know, how are you going to phase out your virgin fabrics? Whether can you even phase them out? That will give you a really strong base to just continually making improvements. And I think that's all that's possible at this moment in time.
And that's not a bad thing either. It's you know, we know that the progress to you know, if we are stimulating demand for more sustainable materials, we are likely to see more sustainable materials. So it's kind of, in a way, I think it's from my point of view, business advantage. Yes, you might face an increase in the cost of purchasing a more sustainable fabric. But if you can demonstrate to your client that that fabric is being manufactured with recycled content from systems that are respectful of people and the environment, that actually is quite a compelling sales point that actually leads printers away from conversations about price only. But it just takes effort, which kind of brings me on to the thorny question of why more sustainable fabrics are hard to get hold of. What's your feeling about that as an issue?
There's multiple things, and you touched on it. It's quite right. Price is still so key, particularly at this moment in time. And it's so easy to look at a fabric and go, well, that's the majority of what we use, so we'll go after that first. I see it all the time. How do we make something cheaper? Oh, let's look at the fabric. But actually, we should be looking at other things first and looking at marginal gains across multiple sectors. So it is things like, is it using less energy? I mean, that's such a big thing at the moment with the price of energy. Do we need to look at economies of scale from a garment production point of view? Where do we need to have products that are lower priced for accessibility? Where can they be higher, and how can we split things so we put a little bit more money into the things that aren't required to be cheaper because they're not providing benefit to people. It's a nice to have rather than a need to have.
Yeah.
We have infrastructure. Like, the infrastructure is just not there at the moment for the scaling up of sustainable fabrics. But like you say, the more we get into this, the better it will be and the better it will become, because demand does drive innovation. And we need our governments to provide support in that. We need the R&D tax grants and tax relief, so that businesses can experiment with things. They can experiment, and they are given that little bit of relief to financially afford to do that. And we also need to get rid of a little bit of our bureaucracy. I know when you look at the mycelium space, patents there's a bit of an issue there around what
when you say mycelium, just for our viewers who aren't aware, so that's vegan leather, and it's an alternative to animal-based leathers, right?
Yes, it's made from mushrooms, and it's very easy to process and grow. So the turnaround or the production lead times are quite low for it. And you've got some that are, like say, backed, they're fillers and they're backed with PU, or you have some that are backed with cottons. There's lots of things happening in that space that's really exciting. But a friend of mine who does grow mycelium has, said a big issue that they have in terms of scaling and getting funding for scaling is that there is a company in the US who has basically sat there and patented every form of available mycelium that could possibly ever be produced.
Wow.
Even before it's done. And she says, and then that limits your ability to go and get funding, to go and to scale. And I think, that makes it harder.
Yeah. And actually, it does point to the importance of checking IP before embarking on a journey, because what a crushing disappointment to find that restriction. And I'm not saying we should condone the approach of the the behemoth in dominating markets because they have the scale and finance to be able to operate their patent process in that manner. Because actually, I think,
Yes.
I tend to prefer the notion of the spirit of abundance, where we have multiple opportunities for products to be developed without those kind of restrictions.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's definitely an extreme view. We
Yeah.
do have, so in terms of like our PA 1010, there's a mill called Brugnoli who hold the patent for the stretch knitted versions of those. And I feel that it is so niche that that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not really, and with a particular yarn, it doesn't really impinge on what other mills can do. So in sort of those instances, it makes financial sense, particularly when you have to put in a lot into R&D, that naturally you have to have that.
Sure. Before we move on to the next question, which I want to ask you, which is about responsibility at end of life, the polluter pays principle. I'm quite interested in the kind of crossover around polyester. So you've got in the soft signage space, so that that is principally a roll-fed fabric printing process. Do you think that are you seeing in what's happening in polyesters for apparel production? Do you think that in soft signage, which I imagine is a considerably lower grade of polyester, that the recycling opportunities are moving us sort of at the same pace, or do you think it's easier for knitted polyesters for that aren't touching human skin to be recycled? Do you have any comment on that before we get into the end of life?
I think yes, because of the fact that you don't need yarns that are so fine. It's not my space, but
Sure.
I don't think you'd need yarns that are as consistent. You could probably have a few little faults in there that in fabric we wouldn't accept.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you say, being next to skin, etc., it should be easier. It should be easier
Okay.
compared to apparel. The one thing I think is we need to look at is how we close our systems. There is a good argument, particularly when it comes to apparel. Why are we using PET? That's from the bottles. The minute you take it out of that process, you can't turn it back into a bottle. So, is it actually better that maybe the signage space can start taking apparel's waste from that, because we know we can't get the same yarn grade once it's been recycled. So, I mean, yeah, it's difficult, but I also suspect price is probably quite key in signage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a recent project, I think, World Cup, just some of the sort of perimeter graphics extended to more than 18 kilometers of
Wow.
fabric, big volumes. But I'm sure that actually when you look at the global volumes of soft signage fabric versus our need to clothe the world, I'm sure that they're still very tiny compared to the clothing industry. So that kind of brings me on to end of life, and I think most people within sustainable thinking are happy with the sense that the polluter pays, but where the polluter pays, whether it's in the price, whether it's price to the consumer, where they have to meet higher costs of production, seems to me to be where things are heading. The kind of the carbon tax of imports, these are all kind of emerging solutions I think might be coming. But what's the view that you see in the apparel sector, and from your point of view, about end of life?
So there is always a lot of discussion and quite heated debate, particularly in the apparel industry, about who is responsible. Brands often feel a little bit sought out as the ones who do the polluting, when it isn't necessarily. I think they don't have enough visibility a lot of the time on their supply chains to actually go, oh, did we make the right choice? As well as lead times, it's a very old system how we work within apparel. It's very old. It goes back decades, or even in some cases hundreds of years, like how our supply chains are set up. And that creates a huge amount of difficulties. So I understand why it's the easy option to turn around and say, well, the brand has to pay it. But that's really difficult, again, when it comes to smaller brands. Big businesses who are totally irresponsible, that's one thing. But there is an unfairness, I think, when smaller brands are trying to do their best, and are being hit with these things. So I think it's everybody's responsibility within the supply chain, because, effectively what we are trying to do is we're trying to limit the impact of climate change, and running out of natural resources. And we're all affected by that. And so from my point of view, this is where I think product passports are going to be really important, because there's a decision made at every step of the way that other people are not involved in. This idea that the polluter makes, they've decisions that they've not made. And so we all have a responsibility to track our decisions, to rationalize our decisions, and to feed that information on, like, the further with it we go.
So I suppose this is where things like RFID tracking, labeling and stuff comes into play, because and actually digitization of the process of transport, of manufacturing, it can bring, we now know we have a methodology that is available at a cost. And it's funny, I was speaking with another guest about recent trip I made to London, and I bought some stuff in Uniqlo, and everything was RFID tagged, and I just kind of chucked it in this hopper, and then it just asked me for money. It was a really, it was quite a novel process, but I thought, actually, as a consumer, that's quite a nice simplification of the process of paying my goods. But I was thinking, actually, this goes far further into the possibility of, where did this item come from? It's item 15,000,001, whatever, and it's kind of, the accompanying stack of transparency data that can be produced with that. That's the kind of thing you're talking about, is it? With the passport, that it.
Yes, yeah. It tells you exactly what it's made of, where it's been made from, who made it. And while it's great, because it gives the consumer the confidence that they've made a good choice, it's really good when it comes to sorting around recycling, so that they know what the composition is. They know what's gone into those dyes. They know what the fibers are, so that they know the best way to recycle it. A big problem that we have is just not knowing the composition of fabrics when it comes to recycling, because we all cut out care labels. Understandably, brands want us to cut out the care labels because it voids our contract with the brand. Yeah. They're not actually there to provide the laundry information or the composition. It's a form of contract between you and the brand. So they will always try and get you to cut that out. And therefore, then at end of life, it's incredibly difficult to know what to do with it.
That's a really interesting point. It's something that I haven't, you know, I don't know why I don't think about cutting labels out. So I think every item of clothing in my wardrobe still has a label in it. But I always think about the RFID tagging, and I was thinking, well, of course, the tag, as soon as you first wear the garment, it might give you, you might be able to scan a QR code on an RFID tag and find out where this is from, and a bit of the story of the product. But as you say, at end of life, that's a really valuable moment to be able to know what it is that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether digital, digital QR coding on individual garments in a non in a using a method that you can't cut out becomes quite an interesting longer term way of determining that. And I'm sure that I think Avery Dennison are really involved in this whole RFID and labeling approach. And it's been interesting. We've spoken with Okotex, and there's Nordic Swan and other labeling and certification schemes. So it's kind of all developing and building, isn't it? But it's really interesting to just think, like, that point I hadn't given any consideration to. And I think for all of us, we're going from a business world in which the economics of business and the GDP, margin growth, they've been the goals of business, is perpetual growth. And I think we're all starting to, we're starting to see that is it's a fallacy. That is not how the future looks. If we're to take an optimistic view of the future, we have to look at value and durability. And I think that's supported by EU textile strategy. I happen to agree with you that I think that legislative impact, we're seeing very little of the legislative impact so far. But I think the EU is, in my view, the EU is one to watch, because I think the textile strategy does give the impression that it's going to challenge fast fashion, poor quality, unrepairable goods. And I was just thinking about a book that I read called, I think it was Overdressed, by Elizabeth Klein, about the high cost of cheap fashion. And it was a kind of a fascinating look at how the US textile industry essentially collapsed on when globalized manufacturing was made the preferable choice. But then as they start in the 1950s and look at the beautiful quality of sewn garments who were manufactured, and then they kind of end up with post Rana Plaza, quality degraded, poor fabric products that just have no durability, but are cheap. And in a way, it's that kind of how we ensure that we provide clothing to the world that is cost effective, but retains some durability. Is a critical factor when you consider the volume of waste to landfills. I don't know. I'm very optimistic that the fast fashion business model will be adapted to be more sustainable, despite the fact that it might take things like the EU to actually say, well, you can't import that into this market.
I think, I do agree with you. I think the EU legislation will be certainly the most disruptive bit of legislation that we have had in the clothing industry, I think, forever. Certainly, it's going to be as disruptive as, like you say, offshoring. It's going to have a huge impact. But I think what we also have to be really careful about is what support is the EU bringing with that. It's one thing to bring in legislation. It is another to provide the support to ensure that that is possible. We have a lot of conversations. I have a lot of conversations around, the rising cost. To be more sustainable, the price has to go up. But how do people afford it? And you're like, well, in a circular economy, people are paid a wage that they can afford it. But bridging that gap, what we don't want to do is create scenarios that are going to be painful for people. So, much so in the UK, for example, you don't get duty or VAT on kidswear.
Yeah.
But we know that that's expensive because the quality has to be better. Like the testing standards for kidswear is unbelievable compared to adults.
Yeah.
And what you need for that. So we need to bring in that same level of support to ensure that things like essentials are not out of people's reach of pocket.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why wealthy people can go to Stella McCartney and and brands like Allbirds, who are all thoroughly laudable in their approach, but it's not them that is the principal area of concern, is it? It's the H&Ms, the Primarks, the Zara's. Those are the brands that kind of have the biggest challenge in that regard. Sam, I think we could carry on this discussion for a good long while. So I'm really grateful to you for joining me today, and I'd like to just say thank you very much from myself and our viewers for you taking the time to share your insight. It's been fascinating, and for our viewers, we very much hope that you'll be able to come and join us between the 23rd to 26th of May in Munich. We have a stand at the FESPA Global Print Expo that we're creating called Sustainability Spotlight. It's going to be built from more sustainable materials with a lower carbon footprint. We have a target to reduce carbon footprint to 10% of a conventional stand build, and importantly, it's going to feature a selection of innovative, sustainable materials that we've had help from Sam to curate, to bring to our attention, as well as those of graphic products. So, if you have the opportunity, we very much look forward to seeing you there. We also, on FESPA.com, in the news and media section, will be providing lots of content online. So there's going to be articles, blogs, podcasts, and videos there for you to review. These are all the kind of interesting topics that we need to be thinking about. So I'd like to say, as we all embark on our journey to reduce, reuse, and recycle, I wish you all well. And yes, thank you very much for joining. And thank you, Sam.
Thank you.